December 1944. The Ardennes forest. The air was a wall of ice, thick with the scent of pine and frozen gasoline. The sky was a leaden shroud that had hung over the Allied lines for days, grounding the plains and turning the forest into a claustrophobic maze of white and gray. This was the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. In the middle of this frozen hell stood General George S. Patton Jr., commander of the Third Army. He was a man possessed by a singular, burning drive to break the German offensive and grind the enemy into the slush of the Belgian woods. But the Ardennes had changed the nature of the war. It had become personal. It had become brutal in a way that defied the civilized rules of combat. Days earlier, a horrifying event had sent shockwaves through the American ranks. In a quiet meadow near the Belgian town of Malmedy, an SS Kampfgruppe led by Joachim Paper had rounded up 84 American prisoners of war and mowed them down with machine guns in the snow. The survivors who crawled back to the American lines brought with them stories of cold-blooded execution. The news reached Patton's headquarters like a lightning bolt. To Patton, Malmedy was not just a war crime. It was a challenge. It was a sign that the Huns had abandoned the last vestiges of military honor. In the heat of that fury, in the visceral reaction to seeing his own men slaughtered while their hands were raised, Patton did something that pushed the boundaries of military ethics to the breaking point. He issued an informal, verbal directive that would become one of the most whispered-about moments of his career. He essentially indicated that there were to be no prisoners, that the SS, the perpetrators of Malmedy, were to be dealt with as they had dealt with the Americans. This is the story of the day General Patton's fury met the moral wall of his own men. It is the story of a commander who reached for vengeance, and the soldiers who, having seen enough blood, decided that they would not become the monsters they were fighting. The atmosphere in the Third Army during late December 1944 was one of concentrated rage. The Americans were exhausted. They had been fighting since Normandy, pushing through the hedgerows of France, only to find themselves nearly cut off in the freezing forests of Belgium. The cold was a constant enemy. Trench foot was claiming as many men as German snipers. Men were losing toes to frostbite, sleeping in foxholes half filled with ice water, and eating cold K-rations while the German Tiger tanks loomed in the mist. When the reports of the Malmedy Massacre were verified, the gentlemen's war officially died. The American soldiers, particularly those in the 11th Armored Division and the 87th Infantry, were looking for blood. Patton, ever sensitive to the morale of his troops, felt this bloodlust and amplified it. In his diary, he wrote of his disgust for the barbarous Germans. He felt that the only language the SS understood was the language of the bullet. The directive was never a formal, written General Order No. 1. That would have been a death sentence for his career and a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. Instead, it was passed down through the chain of command as a suggestion, an understanding, a nod and a wink. "I don't want to see any more SS prisoners," was the sentiment. "They didn't give our boys a chance at Malmedy. Why should we give them one here?" For a few days, the Ardennes became a place of take no prisoners. Small groups of Germans attempting to surrender were often met with M1 Garand fire before they could reach the American lines. The bitterness of the cold and the bitterness of the heart had merged. But as the new year approached, the fighting shifted. The Americans began to retake the ground they had lost. They began to overrun German positions, and for the first time in the battle, they were capturing Germans by the hundreds, not just the fanatical SS, but the Volkssturm asterisk, the old men and the boys. The moment of truth came near the town of Chenogny. It was here that the 11th Armored Division engaged in a brutal firefight against the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division. The town was a ruin of shattered stone and burning timber. After a day of intense, house-to-house fighting, the German resistance finally broke. Dozens of German soldiers began to emerge from the cellars and the woods, their hands clasped behind their heads, their faces pale with the realization that the end had come. The American soldiers on the ground were the very men who had been told, in no uncertain terms, that mercy was no longer on the menu. They stood in the snow, their rifles hot, looking at the bedraggled remains of the enemy. The order was there, hanging in the air like the frozen breath of the dead. No prisoners. But something happened in the silence that follows a battle. The men looked at the Germans. They didn't see the supermen of Nazi propaganda. They didn't see the executioners of Malmedy. They saw men who were just as cold, just as tired, and just as terrified as they were. They saw a 16-year-old boy weeping for his mother. They saw an old man who could barely hold his rifle, his hands purple with frostbite. An officer, a captain who had heard the informal order from the higher-ups, stepped forward. He looked at the line of prisoners. He looked at his own men, whose eyes were hollow with thousand-yard stares. He knew what he was supposed to do. He knew that Patton wanted these men gone, a message sent back to the German high command that the massacre of Americans would be paid for in kind. The captain turned to his sergeant. "Round them up," he said. The sergeant hesitated. "Sir, you mean the order." The captain looked at the Germans, then back at the sergeant. He saw his men waiting for the signal to open fire. He saw the moral cliff they were standing on. He knew that if they pulled those triggers now, they would never truly leave these woods. They would win the battle, but they would lose the very reason they were fighting the war. "No," the captain said, his voice firming up against the whistling wind. "The order is prisoners. We're taking them back to the rear, every last one of them." The sergeant stared for a second, then a visible wave of relief washed over his face. He nodded and began barking orders to the GIs to search the prisoners and move them out. The tension that had coiled like a snake in the center of the unit suddenly snapped. The men began to lower their rifles. Some even reached into their pockets to offer the prisoners cigarettes or a scrap of chocolate. This was the no that resonated through the Third Army. It wasn't a shouting match with Patton. It was a quiet, grassroots refusal to abandon the American identity. The GIs had realized that they could not avenge Malmedy by creating another Malmedy. To do so would be to let the SS win, to let them transform the Americans into their own image. When word filtered back to Patton's headquarters that prisoners were being taken by the hundreds, the general was reportedly furious. He felt his officers were being weak-kneed. He raged in his private circles about the need for total war. But Patton was also a brilliant psychologist of the soldier's soul. He realized that he could push a man to charge a pillbox. He could push a man to march 20 miles in the snow. But he could not push an American soldier to execute a man in cold blood once the adrenaline of the fight had faded. The refusal of the soldiers to follow the no prisoners directive was a turning point in the psychological landscape of the Ardennes. It restored a sense of discipline and purpose to the units. They were no longer a vengeful mob. They were an army of a democracy again. Patton eventually had to back down. The informal directive was quietly walked back. The official records of the Third Army began to reflect thousands of POWs being processed daily. The general realized that his greatest strength, the fierce, independent spirit of the American GI, was also the very thing that would prevent his most ruthless impulses from being carried out. The Battle of the Bulge continued for weeks, becoming a slow, agonizing crawl to push the Germans back to the Siegfried Line. But the atmosphere had changed. The Americans fought with a renewed sense of moral clarity. They knew they were the good guys, not because a pamphlet told them so, but because they had faced the temptation of the abyss and had chosen to step back. In the aftermath of the war, the no prisoners incident remained a dark shadow in Patton's legacy. It was one of the many reasons he was never fully trusted by Eisenhower or Bradley with the highest levels of post-war command. They recognized his genius, but they also recognized his volatility. They saw that Patton's blood and guts philosophy, while effective for breaking armies, was dangerous for building a peace. But for the men who said no, in the snow of the Ardennes, the incident was a badge of honor they carried in silence. They didn't brag about it in their letters home. They didn't tell their wives or children about the day they almost became murderers. They simply lived with the knowledge that in the darkest hour of the war, they had held onto their humanity. One veteran, decades later, recalled the moment at Chenogny. He remembered the German boy who had surrendered to him. He was shaking so hard his helmet was rattling, the veteran said. I had my finger on the trigger. I was thinking about the boys at Malmedy. But then I looked at his eyes. He wasn't a Nazi. He was just a kid who wanted to go home just like me. I lowered the gun. I gave him a piece of gum. That was the best thing I did in the whole war. This refusal to follow a dark order was perhaps the greatest tribute to the American military system. It was a system that encouraged soldiers to think, to have a conscience, and to recognize that an illegal or immoral order was not an order at all. Patton was a master of the machine of war, but he had underestimated the moral compass of the men who operated the machine. The Ardennes eventually thawed. The snow melted, revealing the grim harvest of the winter, the bodies, the burnt-out tanks, the discarded equipment. But among the ruins, something else had survived. The American soldiers' sense of justice had remained intact. They had won the battle of the Bulge, but more importantly, they had won the battle for their own souls. Patton moved on to lead the Third Army into the heart of Germany, performing feats of military brilliance that are still studied in war colleges today. He was a hero, a legend, and a complicated, often problematic figure. But the men he led were the true heroes. They were the ones who stood in the freezing woods and decided that victory wasn't worth the price of their humanity. The no they gave to Patton wasn't an act of cowardice or insubordination. It was an act of supreme courage. It was the moment they decided that the world they were building after the war had to be better than the one they were destroying. They realized that you cannot build a world of law and peace on a foundation of vengeance and execution. As the years passed, the stories of Malmedy and Chenogny became parts of the larger narrative of World War II. We remember the massacres to honor the victims, and we remember the acts of mercy to honor the survivors. We remember that even in the midst of total war, there are lines that must not be crossed. Patton's fury in 1944 was understandable. The sight of murdered Americans in the snow would have enraged any leader, but a leader's job is to temper fury with justice. When Patton failed to do that, his soldiers did it for him. They became the checks and balances of his ambition. They were the ones who ensured that the Third Army would be remembered for its speed and its strength, rather than its cruelty. The story of the refused order is a reminder that the character of an army is determined not by the stars on a general's shoulders, but by the hearts of the men in the ranks. It is a reminder that the power to say no to a wrong is just as important as the power to say yes to a duty. In the final accounting of the war in Europe, the American GI stands as a figure of liberation. They were the ones who opened the gates of the camps, who fed the starving, and who brought a sense of order back to a shattered continent. They could only do that because they had refused to let the war destroy their internal sense of right and wrong. The Ardennes remains a place of pilgrimage for those who want to understand the cost of freedom. The monuments stand in the quiet clearings, some to the fallen Americans, some to the victims of the massacres. But there is an unwritten monument to the men who stood in the snow and chose mercy. Their legacy is the world we live in today, a world where the rules of war, however imperfectly followed, still exist to protect the innocent and the surrendered. Patton's "No Prisoners" directive remains a cautionary tale of what happens when the stress of command meets the darkness of the human heart. It is a lesson for every leader in every age, that vengeance is a hollow pursuit, and that the true measure of a victory is how you treat the defeated. The men of the Third Army who said no were the ultimate victors. They defeated the German army, and they defeated the darker impulses of their own leadership. They returned home with their heads held high, knowing that they had fought a good war in every sense of the word. They had seen the abyss, and they had turned away. As we look back on the legend of George S. Patton, We must look through the eyes of the men who followed him, and the men who knew when to stop following him. They were the ones who made the legend possible, and they were the ones who made it honorable. The story of the day they said no is perhaps the most important story of the entire war, for it is the story of how we remained human in the face of the inhumane. The war in the Ardennes was a test of iron, but more than that, it was a test of spirit. The iron of the tanks eventually rusted away, but the spirit of the men who chose mercy remains as a beacon for all who follow. They taught us that even in the coldest winter, the warmth of human compassion can still be found if we are brave enough to reach for it. Patton may have given the order, but the soldiers gave the answer, and that answer, no, saved the soul of the American army. It is a story that reminds us that we are always responsible for our actions, regardless of who gives the orders. It is a story of individual conscience in the face of collective madness. The forests of Belgium are quiet now. The snow still falls every winter, covering the scars of the earth. But if you stand in those woods and listen to the wind, you can almost hear the echoes of that long-ago battle, the roar of the engines, the crack of the rifles, and the quiet, resolute voice of a captain telling his men to lower their guns. That voice is the sound of democracy. It is the sound of freedom. It is the sound of the world we were meant to be. The legacy of the Third Army is not just in the miles it covered or the enemies it defeated. It is in the prisoners it took. It is in the chocolate bars shared in the snow. It is in the decision to see the human being behind the enemy uniform. This is the true story of Patton's men, the men who were strong enough to fight and strong enough to forgive. In the end, Patton himself seemed to realize the weight of what had happened. In his later writings, he spoke with a begrudging respect for the stubbornness of the American soldier. He realized that he didn't just lead an army of soldiers, he led an army of citizens. And a citizen's first loyalty is to the truth and to the inherent dignity of the human person. The day his men said no was the day Patton truly became a part of a winning cause. It wasn't the day he took a city or crossed a river. It was the day his men showed him that they were better than the enemy they were fighting. It was the day they proved that the light of the American spirit could not be extinguished, even by the darkest orders of its most famous general. We honor Patton for his genius, but we honor his men for their character. Together, they forged a victory that changed the world. But it was the men's character that ensured the victory was one worth having. The no in the Ardennes was the first word of the peace that followed, a peace built on the understanding that even in war, we must remain human. This is the story of the one order Patton gave that his soldiers refused to follow. It is a story of courage, of conscience, and of the enduring power of the human heart to choose mercy over vengeance. It is a story that should never be forgotten, for it is the story of who we are at our very best. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories about World War II.